Buongiorno e benvenuti e grazie per essere qui nonostante il tempo non sia clemente e temo che le previsioni siano non del tutto a noi favorevoli, ma noi oggi siamo al coperto e quindi possiamo iniziare questo nostro incontro. Io ringrazio soprattutto per il momento la professoressa Antonioli, che è la nostra preside vicaria, e porterà il saluto appunto del professor Cortese, impegnato dove ci ha mandato un biglietto di incoraggiamento, un'email di incoraggiamento per questo convegno. Luisa, ti ringrazio e ti do la parola.
Grazie. First of all, let me thank the many foreign guests that are now in Trento, and I welcome them. I'm very happy to have this distinguished audience. You're not very lucky with the weather, but still luckier than 1 week ago. So there's always something worse that might happen. So thank you for being with us. Grazie a tutti per essere presenti. Mi fa un po' così strano salutare come vicepreside, perché in realtà io sono abituata che Peppe è il mio preside, perché lo è stato per i 6 anni, quindi venire a introdurre i suoi lavori è un po' strano, ma lo faccio con grande piacere perché credo davvero che in un convegno come questo vengano fuori tutte, come posso dire, gli atu, tutte le doti di Peppe, non solo come accademico, come studioso, ma anche come persona che ha una grande esperienza pratica sia a livello internazionale che a livello nazionale, e quindi mi pare che la struttura di questo convegno, seppur molto, come dire, compattata nel tempo, davvero dia l'opportunità di trattare una serie di temi che sono estremamente rilevanti e di farlo avendo una platea che può portare esperienze di tipo diverso, prima di tutto per la provenienza nazionale, quindi per poter comparare esperienze diverse, vedere quali sono i vari tipi di meccanismi, quali sono le opportunità, quali sono le difficoltà, ma anche perché ci sono voci diverse nell'esperienza accademica, ma anche di chi lavora quotidianamente e chi lavora all'interno delle istituzioni. Questo per noi è un'esperienza molto preziosa perché questa sede ha tradizionalmente avuto sempre un occhio di riguardo alla dimensione internazionale e transnazionale del diritto, e con una lunga serie di iniziative a partire da quelle che col gruppo degli internazionalisti è stato fatto molti anni fa sulla Corte Penale Internazionale. E direi che mai come in questo momento c'è bisogno di riflettere a 360 gradi su questioni come quelle dei diritti umani, che per certi versi sono perennemente, diciamo, sulla bocca di tutti, sui giornali, sui media, una discussione quotidiana, e che al tempo stesso sono così messi a repentaglio che rischiano davvero di diventare parole vuote. Quindi credo che riflettere insieme, studiosi e persone che si occupano di queste tematiche, e di farlo con i nostri ragazzi, perché naturalmente il nostro scopo precipuo è quello di formare giuristi che siano in grado di prendere in mano queste sfide, che sono davvero le sfide di oggi. Quindi credo che davvero questa sia un'occasione molto preziosa per noi, ma anche per i nostri ragazzi, e spero che avranno modo di discutere, di confrontarsi con voi. Quindi vi ringrazio molto. Io purtroppo adesso appartengo anche alla Scuola di Studi Internazionali, abbiamo in concomitanza un altro evento lì, quindi non potrò rimanere ad ascoltarvi, ma spero molto di poter tornare e venire con voi domani, e poi comunque approfitterò della registrazione dell'evento, che è una delle cose che qui facciamo e che credo sia particolarmente utile, visto che l'ubiquità ancora non ce l'hanno regalata. Quindi buon lavoro e grazie davvero a tutti.
Grazie. Thank you very much, Luisa, also for your kind words addressed to me. I'd like to start by thanking everybody who is here, and I wish to give you a warm welcome to Trento. Also on behalf of Ms. Chiara Te Antoniazzi, Scientific Co-Coordinator of the meeting, and on behalf of Minister Fabrizio Petri, President of the Interministerial Committee for Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, who gladly accepted to co-organize this meeting. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'd like to start by saying a few words about the reasons for this meeting. It's a long time, Fabrizio knows this, that we were planning this gathering of experts, academicians, diplomats, civil society, including NGO representatives, politicians, to discuss an issue that has been on the agenda of the Italian Parliament in the last 20 years. I refer to the establishment of a national human rights institution, Autorità nazionale per I diritti umani. Italy actually is among the few European countries that has not been able until now to establish such institution. I don't want to read the list of the few countries, but among the big European countries, I would say that only Italy and Turkey, Switzerland and Romania do not have a national human rights institution. This has happened for many reasons. I believe that more than political divergences, what is at the root of this deficiency of our national system is the lack of political will on the part of those who should have made all possible efforts to reach this result. However, nobody denies the importance of the establishment of a national human rights authority. Nobody has been able up to now to overcome the obstacles that have been encountered by different proposals that have been presented, sometimes even by more than one party since the 90s. In the absence in Italy of a national human rights institution, I must tell you a very interesting thing. The Interministerial Committee for Human Rights has been able, after its revitalization in 2013, under the able leadership of Minister De Martino and of Minister Petri, to accomplish some of the tasks that in other legal systems are either assigned or referred to national human rights institutions. References here, for instance, to the coordination, preparation of national reports on delicate occasions such as the Universal Periodic Review. On other occasions, the Interministerial Committee for Human Rights has been able to focus the attention of all the relevant actors on complex and difficult issues such as human rights and business, an issue on which the work of the committee has been highly appreciated at the international level. However, although the Interministerial Committee should be commended for these activities, it is not an independent authority, and its modus operandi is typically intra-governmental. Thus, Italy needs a national human rights institution. Let me summarize some of the reasons in favor of the establishment of a national human rights institution in Italy. First, I would say that surely is the promotion and protection of human rights at the national level by an independent body. Second, I would say that a national human rights institution takes care of the implementation and monitoring of states' commitments in the field of human rights at the international level. Third, national human rights institution encourages the civil society to participate fully and not necessarily in an antagonistic manner in improving the respect for human rights by the state in its main functions. These and other reasons can be recalled to explain why a modern state should establish its own national human rights institution. I believe that these reasons are even more important today in a moment in which, at the international as well as at the national level, it seems that human rights are losing the centrality acquired in the second half of the past century. I was outraged some days ago in listening a young journalist on the Italian television, a young journalist stating that she would be ready to renounce to part of her political and civil rights if she enjoyed a tax reduction. Not to mention here the trend of part of the population in Italy to set aside the international customary law norms that should be felt as legally binding by states. For instance, the norms concerning search and rescue of individuals at sea. At the same time, one should not ignore how national human rights institutions can positively influence the legislative process concerning human rights, or the spreading of education in human rights matters in schools and universities. Thus, it is difficult to understand why Italy does not have a national human rights institution yet. This meeting, so in my opinion, is very timely, and I am confident that those who participate in today and tomorrow debate will focus on what can be done in order to make it clear that human rights are not negotiable, and that the establishment of a national human rights institution in our country could only help everybody and the state in promoting and protecting those rights. The program of the meeting. In order to accomplish these tasks, as I have just recalled, we invited experts, academicians, diplomats, representatives of civil society and NGOs, politicians, to dwell first on the international role of national human rights institutions. This will be the title of our inaugural session with Ms. Catherine Meuwissen, Senior Officer at the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, and Professor Alan Miller, Special Representative of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. This first session and the possible Q&A will be followed by another one, chaired by Chiara Antoniazzi, on various models of national human rights institutions in Europe. Thus, by the end of today, we will have a clear framework of the impact of national human rights institutions at the international level, as well as an exhaustive picture of various models of national human rights institutions in Europe. Tomorrow we will focus on Italy and start discussing the points of view of the civil society on the establishment of a national human rights institution in Italy, under the chair of Filippo Di Robilan. A round table chaired by Pasquale De Sena will focus on the perspectives of the forthcoming Italian Human Rights Authority, on the basis of what has been done until now, and in the light of some recent proposals. The conclusions will be drawn by Professor Bause and Minister Petri. Finally, let me thank again those who made this event possible, and namely the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in particular the Interministerial Committee for Human Rights and its president, and the University of Trento Law School. I am really grateful to those who came here. Trento is not an easy place to reach. We hope that when we will celebrate the establishment of the National Human Rights Authority in Italy, we can organize another meeting, and I swear that on that occasion I will talk to someone I know very, very high in order to have also a wonderful weather. But this time I'm afraid I not have the time and the possibility to catch him on the phone, but who knows? So, thank you very much again, and we start this first session with, I think that in the order, now we have Catherine Meuwissen, as I said, of the European Network of National Institutions for Human Rights, who will start talking about the international role of national institutions for human rights. So, thank you very much, and we will continue discussing.
Thank you very much, Professor Nesi, and all the colleagues at the Faculty of Law here for the invitation and also for organizing this important event. So, as Professor Nesi said, I represent the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, or shortly, ENRI. Before I start talking, I actually would like to know who of you had heard about national human rights institutions before Professor Nesi and his team organized this meeting. So, not many.
All of those, all the participants.
So none of the students, I think, had heard about this concept of a national human rights institution before this conference. Well, this even more points to the importance of also organizing these kind of meetings in universities. I myself, before working for ENRI, which is about 2 years now, I was also working at a university in Belgium, Leuven, and I actually did a PhD thesis on national human rights institutions in Europe. And also in Leuven, which is quite a well-known, or at least in Leuven they are very, they have quite a well-known faculty for international law, human rights law, but the concept of NH rights was also not very known there. So thanks again for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to introduce you further to what national human rights institutions are and why it would be important for Italy to establish such an institution. So we with ENRI, we have been following ongoing efforts in Italy to establish an NHRI already for a few years now. Debbie Kohner, the Secretary General of ENRI, has also traveled to Italy a few years ago, and already a couple of times actually by now, to also support and advocate for the establishment of an NHRI. I am now the Senior Human Rights Officer at the ENRI Secretariat in Brussels, where we are a team of 10 people, and now I'm in charge of supporting the establishment of these institutions in compliance with the Paris Principles in Europe. I'm going to talk about 3 aspects to you. 1, the key international requirements for national human rights institutions according to the UN Paris Principles. 2, the critical role that an Italian NHRI could play in the international human rights framework. And 3, the support that ENRI can offer in the establishment of an Italian national human rights institution. So, already since the start of the 90s, the UN General Assembly has been calling on UN member states to establish these independent public authorities to promote and protect the implementation of human rights. And therefore, the General Assembly endorsed the UN Paris Principles, which are the criteria against which all national human rights institutions are tested for their independence, pluralism, and accountability. Today, we are celebrating 25 years of Paris Principles, of the existing of the Paris Principles, and we achieved that 120 NHRIs exist across the world. Accordingly, the Paris Principles are applied to very diverse national contexts, with different legal structures and pre-existing institutional frameworks. And the Paris Principles are guidelines. They are sufficiently flexible to allow for a wide variety of different types of national institutions. In Europe, there are NHRIs that are commission type of institutions. There are NHRIs that are ombuds institutions, or there are also NHRIs that are from the institute type of institution. And this will become more clear to you also in the second panel of this afternoon, when you will hear more about 3 different national experiences, and each of these national experiences also reflects a different institutional structure of a national human rights institution in Europe. I will now clarify for you the most important requirements of the Paris Principles and how they can translate into reality in Italy. And I'm going to do so by making reference of the current draft law that has been shared with us in advance of this meeting. I hope you also have received the draft law. I'm not sure.
All of them, yeah. I think that participants, yes.
The participants, but the students, not.
We will provide them
so
tonight.
That's great. So today or tomorrow you will receive this law as well. And I think it would be really interesting for you as well to have a look at it, to really understand what the current proposal is and the current idea is to establish this kind of institution in your country. So I had a look at this draft law in advance of arriving here, and I think it's a very good draft law. I think that many of the core requirements of the Paris Principles are met by the current draft law. It's also important to know, before I start going over these core requirements, that none of the national human rights institutions that exist are perfect. There is always a need to further develop the institutional structure, the laws, and also the practice of national human rights institutions in compliance with these international standards. So, let me begin with explaining you these core requirements. There will be 8. First, every NHRI must be established through a law or the Constitution. So I know that the draft we received in advance of this meeting is not a first legal proposal. There have been many and various legislative initiatives that have been undertaken in Italy already. And so it will be very interesting for me as well, coming from the Secretariat in Brussels, to hear a bit more about to what extent it is quite realistic that this proposal will be soon adopted by the Italian legislature. And I think we will hear more about it also tomorrow. The second requirement is that NHRIs should address the full range of human rights. So this means that an NHRI should have the mandate to address civil, political rights, and also social, economic, and cultural rights. And in this respect, national human rights institutions are quite different from other types of public authorities that also may address some human rights, or sometimes they address human rights at a local level. Maybe you know the concept of national equality bodies. Any one of you? Has anyone ever heard about national equality body? Not either? Well, the good news is that Italy has a national equality body because this is a legal obligation according to EU law. The EU equality directives require and oblige each EU member state to establish such an institution. And Italy, therefore, has one. So what is typical to national human rights institutions, because they have such a broad mandate that should cover all human rights in their totality, is that often these national institutions will have also some mandates that are more specific. So often national human rights institutions will also function as the national equality body in a country, or, and that seems to be the case with the current draft legal proposal, is that sometimes NHRIs also are mandated to play a role as independent institution connected to some UN conventions. There are 2 UN conventions that require states that ratified those conventions to establish independent authorities taking into account the Paris Principles. and this is the case for the UN optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. So this UN treaty, binding treaty, requires states that ratify the optional protocol to establish a national monitoring mechanism. And these mechanisms have the responsibility to prevent torture in places of detention and therefore to make visits to places of detention. And this competence to visit places of detention is one of the roles that is explained in the draft law that the future possible Italian NHRI would get. This brings me to the third essential requirement for every national human rights institution. National human rights institutions have to both promote and protect human rights. In this way, national human rights institutions can act after harm is done. That's the most typically for the protection mandate. It means that NHRIs will monitor human rights violations, will make reports on those violations. They will undertake investigations into human rights violations and so on. But the promotion function is as important as the protection function. Why? A promotion function typically allows national human rights institutions to undertake preventive action. And that's very important, especially in the area of human rights, because actually when human rights are violated, this is often irreversible. If someone has suffered a human rights violation, maybe in the end they may receive some damages and impunities, but that will not take away the harm that has been done. The good news is that the draft proposal for the Italian NHRI does address both the competence for the eventual NHRI in Italy to promote and protect human rights in quite a wide variety of ways. So that brings me to the fourth requirement. NHRIs must have both formal and functional independence. And this requirement of independence is a very important element for the NHRI system, and it implies continuous efforts of every NHRI also after the establishment phase. And to make it a bit more concrete, I will explain you a bit more what it means, formal independence of an NHRI. So it's very important that NHRIs can function independently of governments. And that's quite logical, because if you do human rights work, often you will have to address the fact that states do not fully implement their human rights obligations. So it's quite natural that these human rights defenders, national human rights institutions, are therefore need to be independent of government. So what is important, for example, is that NHRIs can report to Parliament and that they do not have to report to government about their activities. The members of national human rights institutions, so those are the decision makers within national human rights institutions, need to be recruited through an open, transparent, and participatory procedure. So typically this means that it is not the government who's going to appoint and decide who's going to be the member of the national human rights institution, but that it will be through selection and appointment processes of Parliament, with participation of civil society organizations. And this is maybe an element where the current draft proposal is not so clear. That is how civil society will participate in the foreseen appointment and selection process of NHRI members. What is also very important, but often very difficult for governments, is to ensure adequate funding of national human rights institutions. And this is maybe, it's very important, because without adequate funding, it means that an NHRI, maybe you can have a very nice mandate on paper, but then if you don't have the means to implement those roles, then the law actually becomes a dead letter. And this is maybe also the weak spot, or the most important weak spot of the current legislative proposal. So if you receive the proposal in your mailbox one of these days, you can have a look at Article 4 of the draft law. And if you read that article, you will see that the law foresees in a temporary budget from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the establishment phase of the National Human Rights Institution, and a real separate budget for the NHRI will only be adopted at a later stage by the relevant ministries. And this can be very important, because it is very important that the NHRI will be established and that it will be able to also see what its priorities will be, and on the basis of the prioritization of its role, the NHRI will then also decide, or should be able to decide itself, how it will allocate its budget to its different functions. But in the current draft law, it's a pity that there are not really any provisions or language included to ensure that the eventual budget of the NHRI would be adequate for the institution to carry out its functions effectively and in an independent manner. And so in the same sense, the provisions of the law on internal organization and staffing, and that's Article 3 of this draft law, they do also not, at least in the initial establishment phase of the NHRI, foresee that the NHRI will have sufficient staff and that it can also appoint its own staff depending on the roles of the NHRI. So at least for the initial phase, the law foresees that actually the staff of the NHRI will be taken temporarily from public services. So the law says that public services will, I see, yeah, okay. I saw some no nodding, but it's okay, so I will continue. So the draft law indicates that some public ministries will allocate staff temporarily so that the NHRI can start its functioning. And this arrangement, again, maybe it's needed to allow that an NHRI would be established, but it's very important in order for the NHRI to live up to the international requirements of the Paris Principles, that it will eventually have its own mandate to organize its own staffing. And the draft law also indicates a process in which this would be done after 6 months of the establishment of the NHRI. But it will, of course, remains to be seen whether this will then also happen. And whether this will also happen in a way that allows for the future Italian NHRI to effectively fulfill its mandate in an independent manner. So this brings me to the fifth requirement, that is a requirement of accountability. What means accountability? It means that an NHRI as public institution that also gets public funds needs to explain to public authorities, to the parliament, how it has been making use of the public money. And therefore, the Paris Principles require national human rights institutions to report annually to parliament and also to report not only on its activities, but also on the human rights situation in the NHRI's jurisdiction and the steps the NHRI has undertaken to address the human rights concerns. So this reporting requirement that is there on the international level also serves to ensure the effectiveness of national human rights institutions. In the draft law, it does comply in this sense with the Paris Principles because it foresees in annual reporting to Parliament. But again, also on this point, the law could be further strengthened by including a requirement not only for the NHRI to propose and to present its annual report to Parliament, but also to require Parliament to consider the recommendations of the NHRI. It's important for you to know that NHRIs, they do not have binding decision-making power. Their power comes from convincing decision makers to take decisions in compliance with human rights and to follow up their recommendations. And so it's a good practice or a best practice that legal mandates of national human rights institutions include a requirement for Parliament to consider the recommendations of the NHRI and to also respond to the recommendations and to do this in a reasonable time frame. That brings me to the sixth requirement for NHRIs, and that is the requirement of pluralism. Pluralism refers to the representation of all sections of society in the members and staffing of national human rights institutions. And so typically, NHRIs will, for example, also include some representatives from the academic world. So possibly professors from certain law faculties could become members of a future national human rights institution in Italy. The Italian proposal, so the draft proposal we got, makes reference to various members of NHRIs. I think it foresees 1 president and 4 members. And it could be considered also to include in the legislative proposal a reference to diversity of the membership. So to ensure that indeed the different parts of civil society would be represented in the NHRI. So typically, I already said it can be representatives of academic institutions, but also typically they will include representatives of human rights NGOs of a country. The 7th requirement of the Paris Principles is the cooperation of NHRIs with other national actors working on human rights, including the organs of the state. So the Interministerial Parliamentary Committee would be a very important counterpart of a future NHRI, as well as academia and non-governmental organizations. NHRIs can only fully understand the human rights situation in their country through systematic and open cooperation with the various actors in the field. And this is also quite well foreseen in the current draft law. So that brings me to the final key requirement, and that's the cooperation of NHRIs with international and regional human rights mechanisms. All national human rights institutions have to apply international human rights instruments and, when relevant, need to encourage the ratification of international human rights conventions. You will probably all know, sitting in this class, that there is an ongoing proliferation of new human rights treaties that become more and more precise in the obligations for governments to actually implement the human rights standards. And this then brings me to the second part of what I wanted to highlight, and that is some observations on the Italian situation in the wider human rights framework. So we know that actually on the basis of the current draft proposal, it would be quite likely that such an Italian national human rights institutions would comply with the international minimal requirements foreseen in the Paris Principles. And why is that so important? Professor Nesi already flagged out that Italy is one of the last EU member states without national human rights institution. And I have a bit a different number, which is maybe a bit more shocking, I think. So from the European Union member states, Italy is one of the 3 countries that do not have any national human rights institution at all. The 2 other states are Estonia and Malta. So it's Estonia, Malta, Italy within the EU. So ENRI, we as network, we have members across all other EU member states, as well as in many countries in wider Europe. So you all know that the EU has 27 or 28 still member states, sorry. And the Council of Europe has 47 member states. ENRI has 42 members in 39 countries. Of the full membership of ENRI, so out of 42 institutions, we have 27 NHRIs that fully comply with the Paris Principles and have an A status. As far as EU member states are concerned, 17 out of the 28 EU member states have an A status NHRI, and Italy is not one of them. So I would also like to address why it is important to establish an NHRI and how an NHRI is different from other national institutions working on human rights. NHRIs are typically described as bridge builders. NHRIs are bridge builders between civil society and the state. Through their cooperation with non-governmental organizations and other civil society actors, NHRIs collect an overview of the human rights situation in their country, and due to their public mandate, they are established by law, NHRIs can bring directly to government, parliament, and other state bodies their findings on the situation of human rights in the country. And that's something what non-governmental organizations cannot do so easily. Secondly, national human rights institutions provide a bridge between the national and the international arena. NHRIs apply international human rights standards, as Professor Nesi pointed out, and they do so as independent national experts with a full understanding of the local context. So therefore, it's important that these national independent institutions also report independently to international and European mechanisms that monitor the implementation of human rights by states. And it was interesting, and you will see that it's interesting that the draft proposal of the law refers to a role of the Italian NHRI in the promotion of the implementation of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And indeed, the rules of procedures of the European Court do provide a formal role for national human rights institutions to intervene in the process of the execution of judgments by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. And many of ENRI's members do so, and ENRI also supports its members in doing so, in following up the implementation of the judgments of the courts. And we have published guidelines on how NHRIs do so, and you can find them on the ENRI website. So if you are interested in what ENRI does, you can visit our website, and the website is www.enri.org. Within the wider human rights framework, NHRIs differ from other national bodies working on human rights in at least 3 respects. First, as I said, NHRIs work on the full range of human rights and policy areas within a complete geographic area of the state. And this is also clearly foreseen in the draft law for an Italian NHRI. So as a result, NHRIs are different than the specialized or local institutions, and they can provide a complete overview of the national human rights situation. Secondly, because of their wide mandate to promote and protect human rights, NHRIs can operate in the full spectrum of activities to support the enjoyment of human rights by every individual. NHRIs often work with individual concerns. Some NHRIs have a complaints handling function, but all NHRIs will organize stakeholder meetings as they cooperate closely with civil society organizations. NHRIs also work on the structural, the big human rights problems. And important in this respect is that NHRIs also play a role in legislative processes. So what NHRIs are typically gonna do is to check whether laws of the states are in line with human rights obligations, and also whether the laws that are in place do not negatively impact on human rights enjoyment. NHRIs also help to create a culture of human rights, and they organize training and awareness raising. So these different roles of NHRIs are, they strengthen each other, and they provide a strong catalyst towards the full enjoyment of human rights in Europe. Finally, NHRIs are the only national bodies that are periodically reviewed for their independence and effectiveness in compliance with these UN Paris principles. And this accreditation process of NHRIs, maybe Professor Miller will talk a bit further about it, I'm not sure, but it's organized at a global level, and it provides NHRIs with credibility and legitimacy at a national level because it's an international status that is saying this national institution is independent and credible. But it also makes NHRIs trusted actors at the international and regional level. So as a result, I hope that you are all convinced together with me that an Italian NHRI will be important to elevate Italy's participation in international and regional human rights fora in ensuring compliance with international human rights commitments, and to enhance the promotion and protection of human rights further in Italy at a national but also at a local level. So this brings me to the last point I would like to briefly address with you, and that is how ENRI provides support to national human rights institutions across Europe. So we as ENRI, we undertake activities dedicated to the continuous strengthening of NHRIs in Europe in compliance with the Paris principles. And as I said at the start of the presentation, no NHRI is perfect, and it's an ongoing process for all NHRIs, also those with an A status already, to further strengthen their work in an independent and effective manner. As Professor Miller will undoubtedly address, ENRI is one of the 4 regional groupings of national human rights institutions, and together with the 4 regional networks, we make up the global alliance of NHRIs, known as GANRI. GANRI also has a website which you can visit. So, as such, ENRI is represented in all global meetings of NHRIs, including the accreditation process for NHRIs worldwide. Only 2 weeks ago, I was in Geneva, where this accreditation process took place. And amongst others, the Georgian NHRI, of which you will hear more a bit later on, received an A status accreditation again. ENRI works to support European NHRIs, and our activities include capacity building for NHRIs. We organize every year an NHRI academy, and we also support the exchange of information and good practices amongst our members, and we also promote peer learning between the NHRIs so that they can learn from each other what works and what does not work so well in their national contexts. And we also actively promote solidarity. If you read the news, you will probably be aware that currently the human rights situation across Europe is not the most optimistic one. And in this context, where in many national situations human rights come under pressure, it's even more important that independent human rights actors, such as national human rights institutions, come together and support each other in their work. And that's what we try to facilitate with our network, ENRI. We also coordinate thematic working groups, which bring together experts from across our members in Europe to work on key human rights areas. We currently have 3 strategic priorities, and that's 1, the rule of law, 2, economic, social, and cultural rights, and 3, asylum and migration. ENRI also works on rights of persons with disability, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, business and human rights, other persons' human rights, and the role of NHRIs in situations of conflict and post-conflict. Again, you find way more information on our website. What we also do at the Secretariat is to facilitate the engagement of our members with regional human rights mechanisms, including representation at the Council of Europe Steering Committee on Human Rights, the OSCE's Human Dimension bodies, the Human Rights Committees and groupings of the European Parliament, the EU Council, the EU Commission. We cooperate with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations and its regional office that is also located in Brussels, the European Ombudsman, and many more European human rights actors. Actually, if you are very interested in Europe and what human rights mean in Europe, I think it would be a nice way to study the different frameworks that are out there in Europe through the lens of what NHRIs do in these different human rights fora. So maybe if you have to write a paper for Professor Nesi, this could be a possible idea. Finally, and most critically for today, we as ENRI, we provide support for the establishment and accreditation of national human rights institutions in Europe. And we have expertise at the Secretariat of ENRI, but also, and most importantly, I think, it's what makes our network so special, it's the experience of our members. So we also bring together our members in an accreditation support group. And this support group, it gathers European NHRIs that have recently gone through the accreditation process or that have been recently established. And these members of the support group, they also indicated they are willing to share their experiences and their knowledge with peers. So, for example, if in Italy there would be interest and a need for more national illustrations, we can also provide some further contacts. This brings me to the end of what I wanted to say, and I hope for those who had never heard about NHRIs that you now know a bit more. I also hope that in the context of your studies that you maybe consider further to investigate what NHRIs are. There is not a lot of academic work on NHRIs, especially in Europe. It's quite lacking. So I think it could be a nice idea to do so. And for those that are actively working on the establishment of an NHRI in Italy, we of course are fully at your service to support this important initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine, for this exhaustive presentation concerning the main features of what NHRI should be, and also for having given some suggestion as regards the most recent, one of the most recent draft law, Italian draft law concerning the establishment of NHRI in Italy. But we will come back maybe on this, and however, I thank you very much, and I give the floor now to Professor Alan Miller. As I told you, is with the Global Alliance for the institution for National Human Rights Institutions, and I invite him to talk about also the role of international the international role of national human rights institutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers and co-hosts of the event. I feel very much at home in Trento because I'm from Scotland, and it rains very, very much in Scotland. So don't apologize for the weather, although it would be nice the next time to maybe have a slight relief from it. Katrine has given a very detailed and comprehensive account, really, of why Italy should establish a national human rights institution. I'm not going to repeat all of the very, very helpful comments that Katrine has made. Simply to underline, Italy is a big and important country. For its own sake and for the sake of its people, it should have an independent national human rights institution. It's not that complicated, and it should be done. And it should be done not only for the sake of Italy, but for the sake of Europe and for the sake of the world, because Italy is an important actor on a European and on an international scale, and not only internally. Therefore, an Italian NHRI would be extremely welcome into the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions for those reasons. As I said, I don't want to add much to what Katrine has said, and I would like to sort of maybe broaden the discussion out and encourage as much interaction and discussion and comments once I've finished quite a short few remarks. Just to explain my own background and experience that I bring to this event, in the hope it might stimulate some interaction. The Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions is made up of the 4 regional networks. Europe is one, clearly, Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Americas. There are around 120 national human rights institutions globally. 80 of them, approximately, are A-status, Paris Principles compliant NHRIs. So that's GANRI. What does a special envoy of GANRI do? My role is to provide, on behalf of GANRI and that shared experience globally, advocacy at the United Nations and international fora, and high-level representation on behalf of the NHRIs globally in these decision-making bodies in and around the UN. Part of my role also is to support countries establish NHRIs and strengthen those that are already in existence. So, for example, in relatively recent times, I've done this in countries like Turkey, Switzerland, Ireland, Norway, and Central Asian republics, and shortly in Israel. So I just want to put out 3 big questions, 3 big headlines. Why establish an NHRI? And I'm not going to waste too much time in that, because Katrine has covered that. How you establish an NHRI, and what does it then do? And what really matters in all of these 3 sort of big questions? I think the answer to the first one, why establish an NHRI, is not complicated. No matter what the country is and what its circumstances are, national human rights institution will improve the everyday lives of people. That's self-evident, and it doesn't need that much elaboration. But I also think it's important from the state's point of view, from the government's point of view, why establish an NHRI? And I've been to many countries where there has been, for various reasons, a reluctance to establish a national human rights institution. And it might be for a whole variety of circumstances. But often when I'm meeting with these states and they're explaining their reluctance, within a matter of a minute or 2, they then begin to share with me their concerns that they're subject to all kinds of international criticism on their human rights record. And they say that, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch unfairly criticizes our country's record on implementation of human rights obligations. and they look for my sympathy in this plight that they have. And so I say, well, what's the problem? And they say, well, the problem is Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, they don't know the situation on the ground in our countries, and they're ill-informed and misrepresent the situation. And so I said, well, you know, even if I were to accept that, which I don't generally, but even if I were to accept that, there's a very easy answer to that problem, and that is to establish your own independent national human rights institution, which will be on the ground, which will be better informed, naturally, than those outside, and also puts the state, the country, on the front foot, that it says to the international community, hold on, you know, yes, we can all be criticized. There is no perfect country, but we have established an independent national human rights institution. That's a credibility that should be recognized, and we're prepared to be held to account, and that's part of what we bring to the international community. And various countries who you might not think would be well disposed to human rights have actually established national human rights institutions for that very reason, because it does give them an international status that otherwise they're on the back foot. And that's an important, I think, consideration. So that's the why. The how, you've heard of Paris Principles. It's very easy for a country to establish a national human rights institution. It's not a mystery. Scores and scores of countries have done it, and there is this resource of the Paris Principles and the existing networks of national human rights institutions to do it. Apart from being Special Envoy of GANRI, I'm also a former chair of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, and I was the elected first chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. So I have built a national human rights institution with my own hands in my own country. And I did it with the assistance of an Italian. And the point I make here is this Italian, Gianni Magazzini, works for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. And Gianni was a huge support to the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, civil society, and myself in explaining how to implement the Paris Principles. So here am I returning the favour, a Scotsman coming to Italy to say it's not that difficult, just do it. You know. So the Paris Principles are there. You will get technical assistance to the extent you need it from the UN, from ENRI, from GANRI, from other states who can give you the benefit of their experience. What's the most important thing about the Paris Principles? There's all kinds of criteria. They're all important. In my view, the one that stands out and is the heart, the beating heart of an institution is its independence. Because if you compromise that, no matter how much money they have or what other attributes they have, if they're not independent, you can forget it. They're not going to stand on their own feet and do the job that will improve people's lives. So independence is the beating heart of a national human rights institution. And that means from the outset that is held to be extremely important and is understood when you establish an NHRI, is understood by the state. Okay, an NHRI is established by the state, but it's not of the state. It's established to be independent, and the state has to recognize that from the very beginning and not try and compromise its independence. Secondly, civil society has to recognize its independent NHRI. It's not another NGO. It occupies this bridging role in between civil society and the state. So it's a very unique role, and it's independent from both the state and from civil society. And when you first establish an NHRI in a country, it's very important that the public has confidence in it, and they will only have confidence in who you appoint to that NHRI. Because if they are not seen as being independent, then it makes it very difficult for that NHRI to gain credibility in the years that follow. And even if they gradually improve and do things better, it's an uphill task for that NHRI if from the very outset the people appointed to it are not genuinely independent. The international role, the bridging role, is very important. Just very briefly, what does that mean? Well, it means all kinds of things, but again, the main points. The Human Rights Council in the UN system, which sits in Geneva, periodically reviews every member state's human rights record across all the treaty obligations it has made. It's a very important development in the UN system. Italy, of course, is subject to these universal periodic reviews, and it recommends constantly that countries who are reviewed should establish an NHRI as a sort of badge of good intentions and credibility to live up to the obligations that a state has signed. But there's a lot more to NHRIs who will provide parallel reports to the UN system on how their state is performing. So it sort of keeps the whole process honest within the UN system. But also in New York, Ganri is very active, and myself, in opening the doors for national human rights institutions to have influence and independent rights of participation in the New York-based UN human rights processes. You know there are 3 pillars to the UN system: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. So the way it's organized, they do human rights in Geneva, and they do security and development in New York. Not very good arrangement. So NHRIs, by participating in the New York processes, can make a much more coherent contribution of human rights across all the 3 pillars of the UN. Specific processes which NHRI experience can sort of keep honest. The Sustainable Development Goals and the High-Level Political Forum is where states are held to account for how they're achieving the SDGs, which is critical to addressing so many of today's challenges, not least forced migration. The Conference on State Parties for the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Commission on the Status of Women, and the Working Group on Older Persons to establish a treaty on the rights of older persons. Again, the voice and experience on the ground of NHRIs is very important to influence all of these processes and to keep them as honest as can be. So, thirdly, the what. Once you establish an NHRI that's compliant with the Paris Principles, that's the beginning. It's not the end. That's you starting on the journey to do something to improve the lives of the people in your country. I often say that I think a national human rights institution, if you think of a house, and it's got 4 levels to this house, 4 floors. The ground floor, your point of entry, when you go through the front door, that's the Paris Principles. That's the daily bread and butter. That's what you do, all the things that Katrien has laid out. But then you go up to the next floor, like the first floor. And that is where an NHRI that's beginning to get some experience not only is saying to a parliament or a government or a public body or to civil society bodies what they need to do to respect human rights, but they're able to say, and this is how you do it. This is what a human rights-based approach is. This is how you put into practice the human rights obligations that you have. So we're not only sort of lecturing you about your obligations, we're actually assisting you. This is how you put it into practice. This is how you operationalize it. And that's the next level up for a national human rights institution. The third level, or the second level, is again, once you have credibility and influence in the country, which you'll only get if you're independent, you're able to have a national influence on the politics and the direction of travel of the country. And at critical times, the intervention of a national human rights institution can help steer a country and keep it on the right path in terms of its human rights obligations and the well-being of its people. And that's through the development of relationships between the NHRI and government ministers and politicians, etc. That confidence that has been built up over the years. And then the final one, the top floor, is accepting your share of responsibility to the network of national human rights institutions and putting yourself forward to take elected positions, to ensure that experience and best practice amongst NHRIs is shared, and that when NHRIs are at risk in their own countries, that there's solidarity, that we look after one another. So, just in conclusion, I really would hope that there's as much interaction and questions, comments. An NHRI helps make human rights relevant to the everyday concerns of people. It does that by providing the facts and the evidence, the lived experience of people, those whose human rights are not being fully enjoyed by the circumstances in the country. And it does so not in a partisan or a politicized way, but grounded in international human rights law and its principles and its obligations. So it depoliticizes human rights. It actually lifts human rights above the party politics and the toing and froing on a daily basis for power and manipulation amongst political parties. In other words, an independent NHRI brings out the best of the government, the parliament, the civil society, and the UN human rights system. It's like, you could say, the conductor of an orchestra. It makes everyone play their parts in a much more consensual and evidence-based way, and not a disparate cacophony of noise amongst different actors. So I would encourage you to do whatever needs to be done to establish a national human rights institution in Italy, and you'd be extremely welcomed throughout the Global Alliance of NHRIs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. You really gave the essence of what National Human Rights Institution is, and how any state should take advantage of from the establishment of this type of institution. But I think that we have just to welcome your invitation to have contributions from the floor. We decided to have a simultaneous translation in order to allow everybody to intervene. So please don't be shy, and try to get the best from the presence of these speakers now and also later on, of course. So I know that also the Italian students, contrary to what appears, have had some information concerning what we are going to discuss today. So I really will be pleased. I will really be pleased whether there are questions from the floor by anybody, but especially from students. So by students. So please don't be. Don't be shy. But I really think that we have to understand a little more about what a national human rights institution means, and I think really that we already had some very good indications as regards the most important role that these type of institutions play in each and every country. I was underlining at the very beginning of our session that there is, in my opinion, there is a need. I don't know whether it is because of the fact that we are submerged by information, by news, by fake news. Sometimes I am really afraid that we are not able to differentiate between the news that we get, and when these refers to human rights issues, this confusion is even bigger. So I really think that a national human rights institution can play a role also in these blooming and buzzing word that we are living in today. But really, I would like, please, Filippo. Okay, just to kick off. Filippo de Robilan.
Break the ice, because it's correct that it would be nice if students put some question forward. So I have a very simple question in reality. You have both described a very fragmented landscape of these, and you said, Katrina, we're not going through the golden age of human rights in Europe. We are too much aware of this. So how can, given this fragmented landscape that we have of NHRIs being very different from country to country, create a critical mass in order to counter violations of human rights that we see on a daily basis in a continent that we thought was beyond the risk of seeing fundamental rights that we thought were not, as, how could I say, not at the disposal of anybody anymore, that they were so codified that they could not be put under discussion anymore. So how can NHRIs play a bigger role in countering this moment? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Filippo. Any other question? Or okay, there is another one there, please. Thank you.
So we heard about the Paris principles, which were adopted 25 years ago, and how they have influenced the establishment and shaping of national human rights institutions. But I was wondering, I'm directing this to Alan as well. We've seen last month a resolution on NHIs being passed at the Human Rights Council. So it's not 25-year-old commitments by states, it's also 1-month-old commitments by states. And I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit about the contents of this resolution from the recent Human Rights Council, which is, I believe, of September 2018, a very recent show of commitment from a wide range of UN member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question, or there is enough to be said, but so please, Alan.
Yeah, well, just dealing in reverse order, and then Katrine come in at any time.
Yeah, maybe it's better.
Yeah, I was in Geneva, and I was advocating with all the member states for that Human Rights Council resolution, and it's a very good resolution. It's a strong resolution. My takeaway from it is this, like you say, 25 years, and then it's only a month-old resolution from the Human Rights Council, which is very welcomed. And it links to Philippe's question that, yes, globally, human rights is under enormous pressure. Populism, placing the self-interest above the collective interest, plays out in different parts of the world, but that's its core. Counterintuitively, and what we learned from the Human Rights Council resolution in Geneva, was that as this pressure on human rights increases, and the shrinking democratic space in most countries around the world is a very pressing problem, counterintuitively, the number of national human rights institutions being established in countries is on a very, very steep upwards curve. And part of that is because I think what I was saying earlier, that states are beginning to realize that establishing a national human rights institution is one way of holding its head up in the international community, that it is taking its human rights performance seriously. However, not all human rights institutions established are Paris principles compliant. So the danger is a state will establish one, but then not let it act independently. So we're alive to that, and that's why we have a very strict accreditation process. Either you're A status or B status, and if you're A status, you have to be genuinely independent. But the Human Rights Council resolution shows that there is an increasing recognition of the value of national human rights institutions, even in these times. And that takes me, I think, to Philippe's question that, yes, human rights are under pressure. across all kinds of fronts in the vast majority of countries. At the same time, the resilience of people everywhere around the world is on the increase too. People are demanding human rights, lives with human dignity, just to be human. And that is inevitable, because you can bring pressure against human rights, but human rights are something intrinsic to the inherent dignity and sense of worth of everyone. So you can't eliminate human rights. You can place them under political pressure, but as long as there is humanity, there is going to be the demand and the quest for human rights, and there will be ebbs and flows. Globalization has made it very difficult. So many people have been left behind. There is space for populism and for fake news and the dismantling of human rights that have been painfully constructed globally for decades. But this is not the first time that human rights has been under pressure. We're celebrating also the 70th anniversary this year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That wasn't dreamed up by law academics or by NGOs. It came out of 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a Holocaust, and a recognition that a line had to be drawn, standards had to be put out there, and commitments made to achieve these standards. Are we there? No. Have we made huge progress over the last 70 years? Yes. Does it need to be reaffirmed and renewed in the present circumstances? Yes. That demands leadership. And the leadership is to be shared amongst governments, member states, civil society, but also national human rights institutions. They are vital players. So to answer the question, it's leadership, and leadership in human rights today means making human rights relevant to the everyday concerns of people and being able to counter the fake news, the distortion, the populism by linking it to the real concerns of people on an everyday basis, which is not the sort of identity politics, but is, to a large extent, the economic, social rights of people, the right to adequate standard of living, food, housing, health, education, social security, social protection, as well as the fair trial, the privacy, the non-discrimination, freedom of expression, etc.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe just a few words on your question of the role of NHRIs in this fragmented human rights landscape. There is, by the way, also an upcoming book publication of an Italian professor, Lorenzi, on this very topic. So, and I write a chapter in that book on the role of NHRIs, by the way. So just briefly for now, why are NHRIs important in such a context? I think what is especially important is that NHRIs can address all human rights. So they are really actors that can promote the interdependence of all these rights. Maybe it has been a mistake of the human rights community in the past decades to focus a lot on civil and political rights. Human rights has been in hands mostly of lawyers. Lawyers that easily also focus on the rights that are enforceable rights or known to be enforceable rights, rather than economic and social rights that are only progressively realizable. But what we know, what really speaks to persons is what they directly feel. And what people directly feel, it's not whether the rule of law is in place in a state. That's quite an abstract notion that is to interests mostly of lawyers. But what people feel is whether they can live in a decent house, whether they have enough money to buy decent food, whether they can send their kids to school. And so I think it's important that NHRIs, and it's also one of the things on which we as ENRI are really investing now, it's indeed addressing economic, social, and cultural rights even more, and finding also the interlinkages between these economic, social, and cultural rights and the civil and political rights. What is also important is that we need to become smarter in how we communicate the human rights message. And it's also one of the things on which our members ask ENRI to invest more. Because it's clear that in a way, and it's not only for NHRI the case, but maybe also for the wider human rights community, with the exception of some big NGOs, there is a lack of investment, true investment in being very clear about key human rights messages, in being clear that human rights are there for every one of us, and not only for groups that need particular attention, such as migrants and refugees, but also for our kids, our parents, we ourselves, to have and to be able to live a life in dignity and decency. On the reference of Professor Nesi to fake news, well, it's clear that there also an important role lies for NHRIs in cooperation with other human rights actors, such as human rights NGOs, but also state bodies that are dedicated to human rights. I was a bit shocked a few weeks ago when in a Belgian newspaper they indicated numbers on which political parties were communicating on the rights of migrants and refugees in Belgium. 70% of the communication on this topic was done by right-wing political parties. So it's clear that if people only hear very negative fake news messages, that they will believe these messages. And therefore it's of crucial importance that human rights actors speak up and let their voices be more heard in this debate, so that people can actually form their own opinion on the basis of real numbers and real facts, instead of all kinds of messages that reflect a reality that is not happening in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and I apologize for having called you Christine, I think. Catherine, I think, this issue of fake news is something that gives me a lot of nightmares, and I was thinking that maybe national human rights institutions could also contribute to fight what I call the dehumanization that sometimes comes with the fake news. Maybe having a strong network of national human rights institutions could contribute to help national societies to understand what is going on, and to focus on real facts rather than on the dehumanization on the one side and the fake news phenomenon on the other. However, I think now it's 4 o'clock. We are on time to have a coffee break, so I like to thank again our speakers, and later on, thank you very much. Later on we will, in half an hour, we will start again with the second session, which will be chaired, as I said, by Chiara. By the way, I'm pleased to say that Chiara is one of my former students, who is now a PhD student. She wrote a very good and excellent thesis on national human rights institutions in general, and she made also a proposal in 2015 concerning an Italian national human rights institution. Maybe you can send to our guests your and now she's finalizing the PhD thesis on the implementation of the European Court of Human Rights decisions by also national human rights institutions. So I'm sure that there will be very interesting news in this second session. Thank you very much, and see you in a while.
Okay, I think we can resume with our next session, which is devoted to models of national human rights institutions from Europe. Here with me are the representatives from 3 well-known A-status institutions from Europe, to whom we've asked to present their respective institutions as far as the composition, mandate, and concrete achievements of these institutions are concerned. Indeed, as it has been mentioned before, the Paris Principles give states considerable latitude to model the structure and functions of their NHRIs. So we believe it important to invite representatives from institutions that greatly differ from one another to show that various models of NHRIs exist and to get to know them more closely. It is arguably the only advantage of being so late in establishing national human rights institutions in Italy, that we can learn from the best practices of other institutions and maybe avert some of the challenges that they had to face. So without further ado, I give the floor to the first speaker of our panel, Mr. Dick Outzacher, who is Commissioner at the Netherlands Institute for Human Rights. Please, Dick.
Thank you, Chiara, and I'd like to thank all the organizers for inviting me. It's been a kind of a long and winding road to getting to Trento, but I'm happy I'm here. What I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about the long and winding road towards the establishment of the Dutch National Human Rights Institute, and then I will tell a little bit about the organizational setup, which in my view is not the most interesting part, but maybe it will give some inspiration. I'd like to briefly discuss the independence of the Institute, and then what tasks of the Institute is performing and has performed so far. Right button. So the long and winding road towards the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights. There has been a long debate, so I recognize quite a bit of what's going on today in Italy. It has never been taken for granted in the Netherlands that there should be a human rights institute. And that has to do with maybe, if I may say so, the arrogance of many of the Dutch people who are saying, well, we're living in the Netherlands, we're doing all right with human rights. So why should we need a human rights institute? Well, that debate took place in 1999. And only in 2005 you could see that there was a political will to establish the institute. And in the way towards the establishment, there were a number of organizations who came together and discussed the setup of the institution, but also they discussed the strategy to convince the people in Parliament and within the government who were still hesitating to set up this institute. So again, it also has been a strategic debate and also a political debate in the Netherlands. And I have to say that one of the decisive moments why in the Netherlands this political will came into being was the fact that the Netherlands became at one point in, I think, 2003, 2004, was the presidency of the Council of Europe, or one of the parts of the Council of Europe, in the part which dealt with human rights. So there we were, president of the Council of Europe, and not having a human rights institute. So this was kind of an embarrassment for the government, and I think that made a very big difference in the decision at the political level to establish this National Institute. Well, after some preparations in 2012, the official opening took place in a very large hall in the presence of the Queen of the Netherlands, the then Queen, So this was quite an event. I think Alan Miller, he was there. He was one of the guests. And this morning, the previous session, we talked about the support which can be given by ENRI and by GENRI. And I think the support which was given in the initial stages to the Netherlands Institute was, for instance, by the Scottish National Commission for Human Rights. So we learned a lot from other human rights institutions, from Germany, from Scotland, and from some other places. So it's not been an easy process in the Netherlands. That's what I'd like to share with you. But eventually, in 2012, we came into being, and the institute was the kind of the successor of the Equal Treatment Commission, which already existed in the Netherlands. So the Equal Treatment Commission ceased to exist, and all its functions came into being into this new Institute for Human Rights. The institute is a commissioner type of institute, so there are 9. And the law on the establishment of the institute says there can be at maximum 12 commissioners of the institute, but we want to have 9 also because of financial issues. We don't have more money to employ more than 9 highly paid commissioners. There is a staff of around 50 people. Many of them are lawyers, some are researchers. We have quite an extensive communication department as far as the promotion of human rights is concerned. And of course, the day-to-day staff is there. The setup, you see the organogram. These are the 9 commissioners, which are kind of the board of the institute. There is an advisory council, and this was established because of one of the Paris principles also entailed the fact that it's necessary to have the voice of civil society being heard in the institute. So the advisory council, there are people from different NGOs, there are some people from other institutions who are present and who are giving us advice on several matters. For instance, on the matter of the application of new commissioners. Well, we have a director who is kind of the leader of the 50 staff. We have 3 departments. It's the front office and case department, where we deal with individual cases of non-discrimination and equal treatment. We have the studies, recommendation and communications department, which is the department which carries out all the investigations and the reports. And we have the operational department. So that's the organizational setup of the institute. As Katrien said this morning, and I think also Alan said before, one of the essential issues of the Institute of a National Human Rights Institute is its independence. The independence of the institute has been guaranteed by Article 4 of the Act establishing the National Human Rights Institute, which says the institute executes its tasks independently. So it is in the law. Well, of course, the law is patient, and words on paper do not mean everything. So it means that it also says that in Article 16, with the appointment of the commissioners, there's also another issue of independence being put into the law, is that the application procedure will take place by the institute itself. There's one candidate for a commissioner being presented to the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Justice is in fact the person who appoints the commissioner. In fact, in theory, on paper, it is the King of the Netherlands. It's by royal decree. So I'm still very proud of, at home, I have my appointment with the signature of the King. And the advice of the Advisory Council, which I showed on the previous slide, is also very important with the appointment of the commissioners. So those are elements of the independence. And the final element, which comes to the budget, is another element of the independence, is that the budget of the institute is not only coming from the Ministry of Justice, but it comes from several ministries, such as the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Welfare, and even the Ministry of the Exterior. They all channel their parts of the budget to the Ministry of Justice. And the background of this is that if one minister doesn't like us, he or she is not in a position to say, okay, I'll withdraw your budget, because then the other ministries will have their budget, which is being channeled to the institute. We've submitted this setup to the to GANRI, which issues which decides whether an institution gets the A status or not, and it was taken for granted. At this moment, we're in the process of renewing our A status, and the commission who is involved in this is going to make a decision, I think, this year about. Well, which tasks does the Human Rights Institute in the Netherlands perform? It's all listed in the Act on the law establishing the institute. So first of all, is we investigate individual equal treatment cases. That's kind of the legacy of the Equal Treatment Commission, which became part of the institute. So that means that we deal with individual cases of discrimination. We receive about 400 to 500 requests for a judgment every year, and we deliver about 150 to 160 judgments per year. So those are the cases which are relating to the European Union Equal Treatment Directives and the Dutch law, which is based on it. So in that sense, we are dealing with individual cases. In that sense, we're also a tribunal type of institution. So this tribunal type of work we only do as far as equal treatment cases are concerned. Other type of human rights cases which come up, we can't deal with them on an individual basis. We have to deal with them in more general terms, which means that we advise on draft laws, we advise on policies by the government. Either we're being requested by the government for them to give advice on acts of parliament which are being laid before the parliament, or we can do it on our own behalf, which we quite often do. And if there's time, I can give you some examples of this. We investigate and do research in cases of human rights, possible human rights issues. So, for instance, one of the recent researches that we carried out was on care for the elderly in care settings, in institutional settings. There was signals that elderly people, were abused and did not get the right type of care in these elderly homes. So we carried out an investigation. We found out that there's, to a certain extent, there's a kind of not exploitation, but the care which was given and not given to elderly people had to do with human rights issues. Stay with that, otherwise I'll go into too many details. But that's an example of the kind of research that we carry out. We do awareness raising, and we carry out activities in the field of human rights education. We have systemic cooperation with civil society organizations, and also, which was mentioned today, we're quite active in ENRI and also in GENRI. The chair of the commission has been, so far, has been one of the board members of ENRI, and unfortunately, she, because of a big caseload, she had to stop this work. But she was, I think, for 2 years, she has been one of the board members of ENRI. Well, another specific topic which I'd like to mention here is that also we are appointed as the monitoring body of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is in fact in my portfolio. And at this moment, as we speak, we are finalizing our parallel report, which will be submitted to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on the 3rd of December of this year. Now, how do we do this? In order to be an effective body, I think you should also have teeth to bite with. I mean, you can deliver a report to Parliament, you can deliver a report and send it to the press, and the press will report about it, and you will be interviewed on television or by the newspapers. But how can you make sure that things that you do as an institution actually are being followed up? Well, luckily in our establishing act, there are 2 or 3 legal powers that we have. We can actually go into places and ask for information. And people, and whether it's a governmental or a non-governmental organization, we can go in and we can demand information. And these organizations are not allowed to withhold that information to us. So far we have never had to use the power and actually tell people, well, if you don't cooperate, then we will have to go to court. But in a few cases we have to mention that this is in the law, and that opened every door that was necessary. So not having to use the actual power is even better, but the fact that we have the power and we can show it, that makes a difference. So there is the legal obligation for everyone to provide information, with the exception of if there's national security issues involved. We can investigate on site, so we can go to different places. And another legal power is that all our reports are being made public. And that's also, we've noticed in the 6 years that we've existed, is an important power, because whether it's a private institution or a governmental institution, nobody likes to be pointed out in public as an organization which doesn't live up to its human rights standards. So we've noticed that publicizing our reports made a huge difference. I think I'll skip this one. We have decided, how do you decide on what you're going to do? We have a limited budget. The budget of the Institute is around 5.5 million euros. So with about 60 people, that's about the size of the budget that we have. So we have to make choices, and the choices we've made for 4 years. We were on our strategic agenda. We have been dealing with the promotion of human rights education. A special issue became discrimination in employment. We found that through signals which we collected from civil society, from NGOs, that discrimination in employment is a big issue in the Netherlands. So we devoted a lot of effort in investigations, in awareness raising on the issue of discrimination in employment. There's been a shift in powers from the central government to the municipalities over the last 4 or 5 years, which means that municipalities and local authorities also carry a big responsibility as far as carrying out human rights obligations. So that's a topic that we've discussed. And finally, which is also a legal task, the monitoring of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In a nutshell, that's our coming into being and our first 6 years of operation. I think I'll leave it with this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steve, for your presentation. I think I'll... Our second speaker is Steven Jensen, Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Please, Steven.
All right, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the organizers for bringing me to Trento. My trip this morning was very smooth, I should add, so it's not so far away from Copenhagen, after all. So I'm presenting on the experiences of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And we were asked, I think Dirk mentioned this, to talk about structure, functions, and some of the main achievements. So that's how I've structured my presentation here. I should maybe say that my institute was established in 1987 as the Danish Center for Human Rights. So we were one of the about 20 centers or institutions that existed around the time of the adoption by the UN General Assembly of the UN Paris Principles in '93. But the legal framework that kind of governs our work is actually from 2012. So it's quite recent, and I think that helps make it more relevant for the discussion that you're having around establishing a national human rights institution for Italy. I'll start by highlighting some of the features in this law that was passed by Parliament in 2012. And the first paragraph, it sets very clearly that the mandate is around promoting and protecting human rights in accordance with the UN Paris Principles. So what we heard in the first session is explicitly mentioned in the opening paragraph of that law. And I think that's an important feature because some of the kind of the formal institutional safeguards are really quite important for national human rights institutions for the longer duration. We actually had an experience in 2002 where the Danish government tried to close us down. So we know the relevance of these types of features. So the Paris Principles are written in there in the beginning. And so are a number of the functions that Katrine also mentioned earlier in her presentation. In the second article spells out kind of the general duty of our institution, focus on monitoring and report on the human rights situation, analysis and research, advising Parliament, government, and other public authorities. And this bridge-building road between civil society and Parliament is also part of that, as well as education and research and so on. And the last bullet 8, you might not be able to see I don't know if we're blogging for this, but it also includes that we have a role in the contribution to implementation of human rights nationally and abroad. So we actually have quite a sizable international department and body of work that deals with international issues from West Africa to Tunisia, I think all the way to China and so on. So that's probably a unique feature, but otherwise you would recognize from the earlier presentations and from the Paris Principles. But I think the point here is that this is actually spelled out in an article in terms of the functions, which is clarifies in discussion with the kind of different stakeholders and sometimes opponents that we have. In terms of also part of the structure, we're not a commission structure that you just had presented from the Netherlands. We don't have X number of commissioners guiding our work. What we have is a board that has been appointed from different walks of life, including from, for example, universities that are another independent institution. And they provide some of the kind of strategic, managerial, administrative guidance for our processes, so on budget and financing, but also setting strategies for all our areas of work. That's one of the kind of main important roles, and it's an ongoing role because we have quite a lot of areas we work on. So the strategic part of the board role is important. We also have a Council of Human Rights, which is put up with constituted by a large range of civil society organizations, which I would say is more discussion forum than an advisory council, in the sense that I find it to be very interactive. Sometimes it's us updating them on main developments domestically and internationally, and give that input to civil society organizations. Sometimes it's their interest and discussions that is fed back to our work. So I would call it a more interactive structure than necessarily an advisory council, but of course maybe an advisory council can also do that. And then the law also highlights what we've heard also earlier about being an independent self-governing entity within the public administration. We work on a whole range of areas, and there's more than just here. So it's quite a diverse field of issues that we have to be able to address as they emerge as certain issues, but also on a kind of more permanent or kind of ongoing basis. And I'll just present the structure because this reflects what I presented before about the council and the board, and then the senior management. And then our national area, which is on the left here, has a department on equal treatment, where we also have this monitoring mandate on disability and on gender, and that's part of the teams there as well on ethnicity and race. So those are the three major areas that constitute our work on equal treatment, and with some international and domestically mandated roles there. Then we have a monitoring department, which does a lot of work on legal briefs, ongoing. There's quite a lot of legislation to comment on, but also plays a role with the international reporting through the treaty bodies, the UPR process and so on. And we also try to do a big role of getting, for example, the UPR discussion out to the country. So the consultations are not just Copenhagen-based. We organize consultations around the country so people can access these type of discussions and all at the same time create awareness. And that's of course because part of the mandate is also on education and this kind of public awareness thing. As I said, I will not speak to the international part of our work, but the education mandate sits over with the human rights capacity building, because we've in some ways integrated what we do internationally on education and capacity building with some of the domestic work there. And that's both making sure that human rights is reflected in the curriculums of primary and secondary schools, but also that it's reflected in the curriculums of the police academies and healthcare, social care teaching institutions. We're doing a lot of work making sure that human rights are part of the educations across these, the police and the different care sectors as well. So, yeah. One of the things that we have tried to develop, especially since the new legislation from 2012, is systematic annual reporting on a range of human rights areas. Because we did have annual reports before, but we have strived to have a number of priority areas where we systematically know what's going on, in a sense, all the time, or at least update these on an annual basis. And this feeds into our status reports, and it also feeds into our annual report to Parliament. And these are areas, for example, like asylum, children, family life, fair trial, right to housing, citizenship, and the elderly. And in total, we have currently 22 areas that we are doing this systematic monitoring on. And these are public reports. So the information becomes publicly available, but it's also part of a focused report to Parliament. And we take that approach quite seriously, because it means that we're always up to date with the type of knowledge we need. And we work with the Institute for Social Research, the Statistical Bureau of Denmark on some of these kind of data findings to make sure that the methodology is as tight and advanced as possible, because we do help facilitate legislation processes and policy debates, but some of the issues we come up with also challenge some of these things, and it's very important that we have kind of, we're very vigilant with the methodologies when we do this type of thing. So that's something that we're very focused on, and that we can defend these institutional priorities. There's reasons that we have these 22 areas. We think they're critical, and they do challenge the ways, kind of the political debate and the kind of legislation has been going in recent years. So in each of our areas of work, we've kind of clarified what's the vision, what are our main goals, and what do we try to focus on. And this is kind of that there's a strategy for each of the areas that we're working on. I'm not going to detail this. I'm just going to highlight from some of the areas here. And I haven't spoken about communication as an important part of how we do our work. It's not necessarily clarified as a function in the mandate, even though, of course, awareness raising is... Sorry. Sorry, I'm just losing my voice. Sorry. Yeah, I'll try again. It'll probably be a little coarse, my voice, but I've never had this happen before. But the communication part is a very important part of the kind of advisory work, the advocacy, and the research work we do. Because sometimes it's what you do there that actually triggers the type of changes that we want to do. You can do all sorts of legal debates with a parliamentary committee, and we try to do that over a number of years to have legislation introduced on anti-discrimination for people with disabilities. And yes, you do help nurture a discourse, but it was only when we made communication products that told the stories of a 4-year-old that was being expelled from a kindergarten because he had diabetes and none of the carers wanted to give insulin, or a range of other people, that it really triggered something with the politicians. And then it took a couple of weeks to say, we're going to pass this legislation. And that was after 6 years of determined work. So the way we communicate all of this is really an important part of the strategy across all these areas that we work on. And we have to be very strategic in how we apply the communication because we don't have a massive budget for it. We're not a campaign organization like that. We have to kind of really pitch at the right type of levels when we do this communication work, and making sure that we're present in media across the whole spectrum, not just the newspapers and the media that are sympathetic to the human rights cause, but that we make sure that we have a presence also with media that are often critical, or where the letters to the editor are very dismissive of human rights, right? So that's part of having that a kind of broad public profile, but also make sure that the discourse of human rights is present also in quarters where it's hard to convince anyone. So we work across equality, gender, and disability, as I mentioned. And under disability, one of the approaches that we have is really to be very clear on what are the major challenges where we think that Denmark needs to change practices. Sorry? It's not? Okay, yeah. Sorry. And really be clear in terms of where things need to be changed, and always be able to kind of present the case. And this is why we have this approach of listing the greatest challenges, so we're consistent in our messaging throughout until we see the change introduced. And this is, of course, something that goes at the state or parliamentary level, but it also goes at the municipal level. And we work a lot with municipal levels, because a large part of the Danish welfare state is actually practiced at the municipal level. And we've had researchers embedded in municipal administrations to see how they actually work with human rights, to try and understand the everyday kind of work of staff at that level. I'm just going to present a point also on our monitoring, and I mentioned this earlier about that we coordinate the international reports on the human rights challenges in Denmark and in Greenland. So we are also a type of national human rights institution for Greenland, and supporting the work of an advisory council there. And the work there is quite different than working in the setting of Denmark, because it's also, in a sense, an evolving state structure in Denmark. But we take our role very serious in helping with the domestic processes of building a stronger kind of self-government and public administration there, and also making sure that they address some of the critical issues in the country, like on child welfare issues, for example. So we do quite a bit of work, kind of also getting Greenland into the international human rights discussions. And finally, I want to highlight some of the main achievements. So I think, and I've listed a few here, there's something that you could also highlight, very specific interventions on very specific issues that are certainly our achievements for the people that are most affected by it. But I think having this systematic annual reporting has really kind of helped us push the discussion over the last at least half decade, and having these priority areas that we track consistently. And it both the external effect and how it informs kind of our work, and how we pick up new themes for closer investigation. That's part of that kind of ongoing monitoring. We see this needs an even more kind of closer up analysis. Then some of our thematic reports are having quite a strong impact. We've done work on social control that young people sometimes face from parents, and that some of the regulations by the state were not conducive for them to come forward and come help and get help, because the parents would be informed of such an intervention. After a terror incident in Denmark about 4 years ago, there was a program about radicalization in prisons and monitoring that, and we actually intervened and looked at how that was being practiced, and working both with prison wardens, interviewing some of the people in detention, and with the Office of Prisons. And this was not a major report that we put out that had controversial findings. The approach there was have a dialogue with all the stakeholders in this system to see if you could change graduate administrative practices. And this is one of the ways that we see national human rights institutions do some of that reporting, making sure that it's a dialogue process, and that the process actually changes things. And then eventually a report comes, but at that point, some of the issues might already have been addressed. So it's a kind of a confidential dialogue until the process, the report goes public. We have recently done a number of third-party interventions in court cases, because we thought this was necessary to add to kind of the tools we have in our kind of promotion and protection approach. And this is not always a successful approach. I mean, we've won, I think, 1 out of 5 or 6 cases. But what happens is that it stimulates a discussion. So one case we lost was picked up by the political level and led to change in legislation. Another case we lost was on disability, and the UN committee has just heard that case and made sure that the complainant actually won. So we've had the experience of a one major victory, but also that it's part of the way we can address issues, that we can work across a larger spectrum than just, in a sense, the judicial system. As I mentioned, we championed this case for national legislation to prohibit discrimination against people with disability. It was a long-term effort to really change this, but we're seeing those changes coming now through in legislation. And then we produce 200 legal briefs a year, which is a lot, and it needs a very strong setup to do that. But we are seeing that there are human rights issues across so many pieces of legislation, and sometimes we have nothing to comment on. But it's important that the politicians and the civil service know that we're monitoring those steps, even though if it's a relatively late intervention in the legislation, that we're doing that, we're doing it systematically, and we're picking out these type of issues. And again, if we see patterns there, we can use that to kind of do more systematic analysis of what's going on in this policy area, this sector, and so on. And we have seen quite a bit of changing administrative practices, both at state and municipal level. And again, I would argue for this ability to not just think of the state level, but also think that kind of what municipalities are doing in terms of promoting and protecting or violating human rights. And I think one of the broader achievements is this strategic navigation between the political system, the legal system with the cases, and then also kind of the public sphere and public debate. Because sometimes we hit a door that has really been slammed in our faces from the political system when we raise challenges about the legislation. But at least we are there presenting reports, presenting hearings, so it becomes a public debate. 3 years ago, we had a legislation on asylum issues. It was presented on a Thursday afternoon, the legal draft. First hearing in the parliament was Friday afternoon, 24 hours after the parliamentarians got access to it. And we sat down overnight and did a legal brief of 19 pages, which dominated the media coverage the next day on kind of a very, very problematic piece of legislation. We could not influence the politicians there, but we could make sure that there was an awareness in the general public about the problems of this legislation. We can prioritize that. It's hard for civil society organizations sometimes to sit down with that short notice of essentially less than 24 hours to make sure that the media, the national news the next morning had this intervention and raised the human rights kind of problems of this piece of legislation. Final thing is, I think a number of the achievements that we've had as the Danish Institute speaks very well to a number of the achievements that our sister institutions around the world have. And I've added this slide because this actually comes from independent peer-reviewed research that has studied a number of human rights institutions around the world. So it's not just claims we're making. This is, in a sense, documented. And some of these findings talks about what it is that NHIs achieve in that everyday role that they play. And part of it is that they reframe the structural context in which the broader state apparatus operates. This is a researcher called Sonja Cardenas who highlighted that. They also create a social space for public deliberation over wrongdoing. And you can have many ways of having these types of public discussions, but creating that space is itself a significant step forward, I would say. Then they also uphold an important component of an inclusive democratic political regime, namely a stable and enforceable rights framework. And I could go on and highlight other findings from this type of research. But I think this resonates with what I hear from a range of our sister institutions, resonates with our work, and is also something that's coming through in the independent research on national human rights institutions by a range of academics and so on. And I think it's important to highlight that these are broader achievements. It's not just kind of institute-specific achievements, and they are applicable across borders, these type of achievements, if you have a national human rights institution. So thank you for attention, and sorry to the translators if I spoke too fast.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And now our third speaker, Levan Meskoradze, who is team leader of the EU project at the Public Defender of Georgia.
Thank you very much. I also would like to join my colleagues and thank you organizers for this wonderful event and meeting to discuss the roles and functions of national human rights institutions, some progress, achievements and challenges we have in this respect, best practices and etc. I'm happy to be here and to introduce the Public Defender's Office, which I joined actually 1 year ago before I was government official lawyer before the European Court of Human Rights, quite a different side of the protection of human rights actually. Georgia's Public Defender's Office, it's the name of the human rights institution, was established in 1996 on the basis of the Constitution. So Georgia's National Human Rights Institution is a constitutional body which is one of the main guarantor of its independence and impartiality. If you already mentioned, I just use different terminology, human rights institution as well as Public Defender's Office, because this institution realizes and implements both functions. It is at the same time National Human Rights Institution as well as the Ombuds institution. In my presentation, I would like to give you information about the structure and functions as did my colleagues earlier. Actually, the Public Defender's Office is very big and wide institutions, and the functions are wide as well. It exercises its functions with respect to each and every area of the protection of human rights. It promotes human rights, it reacts to the complaints and applications, it conducts awareness-raising activities, it is very active internally and internationally as well. And I will explain below how this actually happens in practice. First of all, I would like to start with the structure of this institution. It is a bit different than the institutions which we just saw some minutes ago. The Public Defender's Office of Georgia, as mentioned, is a constitutional body. Its basis is in the Constitution of Georgia. It is independent, and independence is one of the major prerequisites for this institution, because we all understand how important it is that such an institution is independent and impartial from the government. Public defender is elected by the legislative body, by the Parliament of Georgia, for 6 years. To be more precise, previously it was elected 5 years term, and the public defender could be re-elected, but on the basis of the new constitution of Georgia, which will come into force in a few weeks, public defender can only be elected once and for 6 years. And this is, I think, the strengthening of this institution by this new provision, because the public defender would be only elected once, and there's no space at all to somehow have a links with the executive branch. Public defender enjoys immunities on the basis of the constitution, and public defender is not obliged to, dependent, I would say, to executive body, to any branch of the authorities. What it does only is to report before the parliament once a year about the human rights situation in the country. We don't have the separate commissioners or separate public defender persons dedicated to certain fields. We have one public defender, which is the leader of the institution, which has 3 deputies, and this office, the structure of the office is divided into departments, units, divisions, and etc. Public Defender's central office comprises about 150 persons. So you see how big this office is, given its functions. And at the same time, what is one of the issues which needs to be mentioned here is the Public Defender's office has the regional branches. So far, it has 6 regional branches in different regions, as well as some focal points in remote regions. For example, in mountainous places, and these persons are in charge of supervising human rights situation in their area, and to report to regional offices or directly to the public defender's office to somehow react to the possible and alleged human rights violations in region. Regional offices plays, I would say, crucial role in the protection of human rights in regions. One of the prerequisites, to my understanding, of the independence of the public defender's office is the budgetary issues. If I'm not mistaken, the budget of the public defender's office is about 25 million euros, which is not little money actually. And under the internal laws of Georgia, it is impossible to reduce the budget of the public defender's office. It is even impossible in theory, which is further I would say, ground of the independence and impartiality of the public defender's office. As for the functions, it has the various functions, starting with the promotion of human rights and including supervisory functions. The public defender analyzes and studies the applications from individuals, but also can start the investigation of a matter under its own initiative. For the public defender's office, and public defender particularly, it is absolutely important function to exercise preventive policy. Sometimes the human rights violations issues are not raised by individuals, and when the public defender receives from open sources the information about the possible human rights violations, reacts immediately. And this is one of the main important functions which the public defender has in this respect. It includes not only, for example, the reaction to the human rights violation issues, but also, for example, amendments analyzing the draft laws, or under its own motion submit the draft laws to the Parliament of Georgia for further analysis, and etc. For example, it is like an automatic system. When the public defender receives the draft laws, each and every draft law which is initiated in the Parliament and where public defender considers it necessary, provides its comments and amendments. So far, I just looked into the statistics, and from 2012 until now, 25% of the public defenders' initiatives related to the changes and amendments into the legislation was shared by the Parliament of Georgia. Public defender, as I mentioned, exercises the functions in various human rights protection areas. For example, criminal justice, civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights, rights of children, persons with disabilities, etc. Those rights which are protected under our legislation as well as under international law as well. For these particular purposes, I mentioned above, in the public defenders, there is a special units which work in separate fields. And one of the major functions of the public defenders in this respect is to study the applications about human rights abuses in the country and what is the outcome of such analysis and of such examination or complaint. This is public defender provide recommendations to and proposals to respective government authorities. One of the functions of the public defender is to have awareness-raising activities. For these purposes, the Human Rights Academy is the internal institutional structural body within the public defender's office, and this academy has one major purpose: to raise awareness on human rights in the capital as well as in regions of Georgia. Except the promotion and protection of human rights in this particular angle, the Public Defender's Office was also assigned supervisory functions. For example, Public Defender's Office in Georgia is the national preventive mechanism at the same time, which is based on the UN Convention Against Torture. Public Defender's Office is also the national body created on the basis of the Convention on the Protection of Rights of Minority Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, UN Convention. Public Defender is the equality body at the same time. It was mentioned earlier this morning that the EU directive obliges the states to create the equality bodies, and such once respective law was adopted in 2014. This is called anti-discrimination law. The public defender was allocated as a body which undertakes functions in this respect. This is equality body, studies complaints, and also the applications from individuals about the possible act of discrimination. And the public defender also is the tolerance center, which comprises the national minorities and religious minorities as well, and this center operated within the ambit of the parliament. And finally, the public defender is centered on the rights of the child. So this is the main functions which I try to explain above internally, which is assigned to the Public Defender's Office Georgia, but Public Defender is also the very important player internationally as well. Public Defender of Georgia, for example, for illustrative purposes, I will give examples, provide shadow reports to UN treaty bodies, Human Rights Committee, and other committees as well operating within the system of the United Nations. Public Defender is active within the Council of Europe as well. For example, provides third-party interventions before the litigations before the European Court of Human Rights, has done so far in several times and in several cases. Public Defender has provided observations before the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe several times, thus not leaving a state alone with the Committee of Ministers. In the enforcement proceedings, you know that the execution is just between the Committee of Ministers and the government, and to give the government ample opportunity to persuade the committee about the implementation of various judgments. Public Defender is somehow shadow reporting activities provides in this respect. So in this context, Public Defender is very active. And what I forgot previously when it's about the functions internally is the Public Defender is also very active before national courts, despite the fact that the Public Defender on its own initiative attends the court hearings. At the same time also intervenes as a third party in litigations before national courts. And finally, after studying the situation at hand, the public defender adopts the reports. So, as for the reporting system, the public defender provides, as mentioned earlier, annual reports before the Parliament of Georgia, and also in the course of the year, public defender adopts some thematic reports as well. In particular, reports on children, equality, gender equality, reports on asylum, and I forgot what is about the final reports. Once the Parliament of Georgia studies these public defender reports, it provides the recommendations to relevant agencies which has the legal obligation to implement the public defender's recommendation. Final point as regards the implementation of the recommendation of the public defender is a problematic one. For example, now in the public defender within My Action project, we try to create the follow-up mechanism because until now it's impossible, as I observed, to measure, to assess which recommendation, in what respect and quality we are implemented by which agencies and etc. This is quite important tool to see how the public defender's recommendations is taken into account by respective agencies. Until we know this fact, then the recommendations and all these kind of abuses remains on the paper. So now we are in the process of creation such a mechanism, and we will have the outcome in the near future. That's all I wanted to mention about our institution. If any questions, I would be happy to reply to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Levan, and thank you to all the speakers for their very interesting presentation. I think it was illuminating to see how very different institutions can all contribute to advance the promotion and protection of human rights in different ways. So now the floor is open to comments and questions from the public.
Thank you. My name is Antonio Bultrini from the University of Florence, and my question actually concerns all your presentations. Obviously, national human rights institutions are going to interact with key political decision makers. And so your credibility and authority is crucial. Already in the first part of this session, of today's session, it was underlined that independence is a key factor to preserving credibility and authority, but I suspect that it's not the only factor which is important in that respect, apart from powers, more or less powers you may have. And of course this is a relative issue in a way, in the sense that the national cultural and political context will come into play. Nevertheless, I would be very interested in having your views and your experience. What are the key factors that you are particularly concerned about to preserve your credibility and authority? Thank you.
We can also collect the second question.
My name is Pasquale De Sena. I am professor of international law at the University, Catholic University of Milan. I have just a little question for Mr. Jensen and Mr. Outsider. I would like to know whether the building up of your national institution has been made before or after the building up of other institutions like we have in Italy. For instance, privacy authority or antitrust authority and so on. And whether the relationship between your institutions and these other institutions has posed some question of overlapping of competencies. Thank you.
My name is Barbara Terenzi. I'm coordinator of a network of 103 Italian NGOs working in human rights promotion and protection. My question is for the Dutch and also the Danish National Human Rights Institution. The Advisory Council, we were speaking about the Advisory Council where civil society is somehow represented. Number, how many people are there? How often are they consulted? How do they intervene? The same goes for the Council of Human Rights, if I'm right, where the civil society is represented in the National Human Rights Institution. I'm interested in understanding how civil society is represented and how civil society intervenes, perhaps also in Georgia. Thank you.
I think we can start. Dick, you want to start?
Well, thank you very much. Those are very interesting questions, which also, I think, illustrate the discussion in Italy, which is going on at the moment. As far as the political decision-making is concerned and about the pitfalls and maybe the dangers that you mentioned, there's one experience, recent experience relating to the situation in a part of the Netherlands, won't go into details, where our institute had a very different view on the situation than the minister who was in charge of this. So there was a kind of a discussion, more or less a public discussion between the minister and our institute. And at a certain moment, when it became kind of, when the tension grew, then at that moment, it was both the minister and our institute, both almost at the same time realized we should not come into a position where the minister tries to influence the Dutch institute. So this was a kind of a realization which came forward from the ministry as well. So the minister kind of stepped backwards and decided not to push the issue further. And I think the reason why was because we did not even have to mention our own independence, but this was brought forward by the ministry. The ministry said, okay, now we realize you're independent, you have your own views, and we should not interfere with your views. So I think the shield of independence was used in a kind of a subtle way. That was our experience. You want me to go to the other questions? Or? Yeah. Okay. Well, there was the other question about whether before or after other existing institutions were built up when our institution came into being. Before the National Institute was established in 2012, we had the National Ombudsman, we had the equality body, we had the Commissioner on Trade in Humans, which is also a specific body. We had the Data Protection Agency. They're all part of this whole kind of landscape of human rights protectors. And I think what happened afterwards is when we were established, we started to talk to all these organizations and these people. And there were some organizations, for instance, and I can mention this, is the Commissioner on the Trade in Humans. She was very adamant, and she said, I don't like that you're being established because you're stepping into my territory. So there was a frank discussion, and we decided to make agreements with this institute, and later we copied these kind of agreements with the other institutes. This is their part of work. For instance, the Data Protection Authority, we're not dealing with any issues relating to data protection. The same with the National Ombudsman. We're not dealing, as an institute, we're not dealing with the functions of the Ombudsman, etc. So we made a kind of a working agreements with these other institutions, and so far it has been working quite well. But the thing is, we had to realize that there was overlap, and then there might be some kind of competition between the competences of these organizations. Okay, and the final question about NGO representation at our institute. In the advisory board, which exists of 8 people, there are people from some NGOs involved. So in contrast to what is happening, I think, in Denmark, where there's this council which consists of NGOs, which I think is a very broad representation of NGOs, in the Netherlands it doesn't exist. So what we do is we are arranging our own establishments with NGOs. For instance, in my portfolio, as far as persons with disabilities are concerned, we have an annual meeting where we meet NGOs and we discuss issues relating to persons with disabilities. So the institutional representation of NGOs is quite small in the Netherlands.
Thank you. Stephen?
So there was a little bit of historical chronology to the 3 questions, so I'll start with you at the back and come to yours, and then end with the more current work with civil society that we have. So in terms of the previous bodies or authorities that we interacted with during our 3 decades of existence, I don't think that has been a huge problem. What was there before us was a Danish ombudsman that was created in the 50s with the new constitution that came back then. But that has a very limited mandate, which was really public administration and dealing with what happens in Parliament, kind of very much. So I don't think there's been much competition between the type of mandate and areas of work that we have and the Ombudsman. There is a good discussion, and we collaborate on being the national prevention mechanism under the optional protocol on torture. So we do prison inspections together. So one area where there could have been potential confusion or competition, there's been a way found where both institutions are part of that monitoring procedure. Then if we look at from the late 19th, early 2000s, there was a Council for Ethnic Equality, which was closed down by the government in 2000, and that mandate was moved into us. That was a small secretariat. So that has happened. But in some ways, that has maybe also strengthened and protected that area of work by coming under our umbrella. So there's not like a huge kind of crowded landscape of these type of institutions. When through the EU you created the equality bodies, we were also designated on that, and we have this mandate both on gender and disability. So in some ways we've got arranged. So it's not the institutional kind of confusion that I think is there. And then of course there are different public bodies that we then try to work with. It could be a data protection agency and try to bring in the strength and the capacities now also more of the statistical bureaus, which I think actually happening around a number of countries to bring in that element into some of the work. So it hasn't, I mean, I know in Sweden they've had like 9 different ombudsmen, and harmonizing that to create our National Human Rights Institute is much more complex than what we've faced in Denmark. And then this aspect of kind of the independence and credibility and authority and how you interact with the key political decision makers. I mean, we've been through different processes because, as I mentioned, 15 years ago, the government tried to close us down, and that was a shock to many. And there was a very strong counter move, both from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson at the time, and from a number of the sister institutions. So the international reaction, but also the domestic reaction, was one of protecting and standing up for us. And I think the politicians, they do not want to revisit that, even though they criticize some of our work. I mean, we've had weeks where we're hammered by the Minister of Integration in the press. At the same time, the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Social Affairs are coordinating their schedules so they can meet with us together on other areas of our work. So we have to navigate that of public criticism and having access to the highest level of decision makers. That's part of, I think, maybe the schizophrenia you have to live with as a national human rights institution, with the political interests that are out there across a wide spectrum. I think in terms of having that authority, you're right, it's not enough with independence. We do a lot out of kind of the legitimacy and credibility through a public profile, in a sense being fair, having our facts straight, that it's well researched. This point I mentioned about being very vigilant with the methodologies that we use in our investigations, in our inquiries, the type of data that we access, and work with others that have further expertise on these type of things. And then, in a sense, being present across the whole spectrum. I mean, this I mentioned about we're there in the debates in media that are not pro-human rights. We're not shying away from that. And I think having an ongoing, also behind-the-scenes dialogue with parliamentarians and ministers, it's not something that is very visible. I mean, it's not even visible for me as a staff, what my directors do there. They sometimes report on it, but it helps at least build an element of trust for the occasions where we come out with strong criticisms. And one of the things that the directors do is, after an election, they immediately start trying to approach the different spokespeople for different mandate areas. So you might have a new government that changes the whole kind of who are ministers and who are shadow spokesperson, new politicians or parliamentarians elected, and really do that relationship building and tell them what are our priorities, what are our concerns. So you start an ongoing dialogue. So it's not when the house is burning that you have that interaction. And I think that ongoing attempt at dialogue helps us in the more critical moments, saying there's substantial disagreement, but that doesn't mean that there will be an outright attack on we're doing, and I think there's a very strong understanding that we have an international mandate that we're doing, and we're based in very kind of meticulous readings of domestic law and international human rights law. Maybe sometimes we find that the case law from the European Court is too narrow, so we're saying we can't actually come out with something strong on this. And that's sometimes what we get criticized for in the public, saying, why are you not stronger on this? We don't have a basis for it. And not having a basis for it and saying that sometimes also shows that we're not kind of always just kind of advocating things. Then this last point about engagement with civil society, I think it's important to say that it happens at many levels and in our daily work. So this council structure is one element, it's the more formal element. I think there's somewhere between 25, 30 civil society organizations part of that council. There's also members appointed from political parties there, so there's also a discussion that goes on in that council between civil society organizations and members from political parties, not parliamentarians normally, but so there is that potential for discussion. And often it's brought, what are the trends in kind of in human rights dynamics in the country, in legislation and so on. It's more an open-ended discussion. It's not that there's a activity plan and stuff gets implemented, but there's some very strong NGOs with very strong human rights competence, and others have very specialized interest and maybe not the strong human rights competence, but they get influenced and have this interaction, and they can bring it back to their organizations. But I would say it's also what happens in many other areas. When we work on disability, we work with the NGOs in that area. And they're the ones also saying we played an important role in getting that legislation. They have no problems kind of giving us that credit, but we would not move forward with that work without having that type of discussion about, are we doing the right thing? Are you in agreement with this type of thing? So it happens across each of our mandate areas. And we also try to do training courses for free for civil society organizations to help lift their human rights expertise and capacity so they can be kind of stronger voices in this. So it really is across a very wide spectrum that we do that and try to give platforms for civil society as part of this this discussion. We have an annual political festival in Denmark. Next year we're not going to do our own events. We're going to make a human rights tent where we put civil society forward and get that public, because we think we have a strong public profile. Let's elevate the others, and we use our resources where organizations that sometimes have very few resources that can do that. So it's really it's everyday work, that type of engagement. Thank
Just a short reply to your question about the political independence and neutrality of the Public Defender's Office, how it's ensured. Actually, there might be many factors which ensures the independence of the Public Defender's Office, but I think that the decisive point here is the election procedure. The government is out of this game, and it's civil society which nominates the candidature for the Public Defender's Office. It's not actually, it's just a practice that civil society does so, but now we are in the process of codifying this practice in law, and in future, once the parliament adopts finally the law, civil society will be only empowered to nominate 3 candidates to take in this post, and finally, of course, it will be the parliament which will ensure the appointment of the Public Defender's Office. Due to and many other factors, this is why in Georgia the trust of the public towards Public Defender's Office is very high, according to one of the last authoritative surveys. If I'm not mistaken, around 85% is acquainted with the Public Defender's Office in the population, and about 75% or something like this is has a trust towards the Public Defender's Office, which is, I think, second trustful person in the country after Orthodox Church. So. So this is normally neutrality is ensured in this way, and this is a decisive factor, even though in Georgia political life is very hot. Maybe you are aware of this. Even it is hot, it doesn't matter whether it's pre-election or post-election period, it's always hot, and 100% of population is involved in this process. And why I'm mentioning this? Because public defender has also, of course, a certain role in political life. Why? Because human rights issue can become a political issue and matter of debate. For example, there was a killing of a minor in Georgia several months ago. This is one of the hot issues now in Georgia. Of course, public defender is in a position to assess how investigation was ongoing, how trial was in line with the standards of fair trial standards, and etc. But what I'm trying to say is that the public defender have to keep balance between the political and legal life, and this means much to somehow remain the political independence. As for shortly about your question, NGO representation. There are certain platforms within the Public Defender's Office where the NGO are represented, and for example, I mentioned Religious and Ethnic Minority Council and Tolerance Center, where the civil society is represented, and this is some kind of platform which operate within the Public Defender's Office. As for the rest, normally it takes ad hoc basis. It's not a formalized, but Public Defender has quite frequent meetings with civil society and takes notes about their concerns and about the issues which they raise. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Fabrizio Petri, the President of the Interministerial Committee for Human Rights. I would like to know, how would you describe the impact of your institutions in this moment of shrinking spaces for human rights issues? Meaning, are you developing new form of approaches? Or in any case, a comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Other? No? Then maybe I will add a little question to all of you about the complaint handling function of NHRIs. So I was wondering, what your opinion is about it. You have very different mandates in this respect. So I would say it is central to the mandate of the Public Defender of Georgia to receive complaints of violations by individuals. The Netherlands Institute for Human Rights is active in the area of discrimination in the sense, whereas the Danish Institute, if I understood correctly, doesn't have this function. But I was wondering So do you think that this function brings the population at large closer to the institution and, make the institution more credible, legitimate, closer to the public? Thank you.
Right. Well, the first question about the impact of the institution, it's a bit of a difficult question because it's very difficult for us to assess what is the impact of our institute. We did not investigate this, so I can only kind of try and give my own experience as far as this is concerned. What we notice is that I think in these times where there is much more room for populism, etc., that I think the role of the Human Rights Institute can be to promote this human rights perspective in a political debate, in a society debate, because the human rights perspective, if you propose it in a proper way, does not take political sides. And I think human rights institution can contribute in this sense to, if you wish, making a more normal situation to the debate. That's the theory. If it is working in practice, that's for me difficult to assess. But at least if we take a stand in political issues which obviously come towards us, then we always try to rephrase it and reframe it into a human rights perspective. And the funny thing is, for instance, if you look at the things which are happening at the local level, where there's not so much political infighting going on, but people often do not realize what the human rights perspective entails, what it is. So if we introduce in the discussion a human rights perspective, then what you often see is that people start to realize, okay, so that's the case. And I think that's the kind of movement that we're trying to achieve and the impact we're trying to have. Well, as far as your question is concerned, does it bring the complaints handling? Does it make a difference, and how will you bring civil society closer to you and make civil society more aware of situations? There's a very practical example I can give you. The traveler community, Roma, Sinti, in the Netherlands has been very outside of common society. I think that's the experience of probably in Italy, probably in other countries as well. So they were never able, also they are not used to putting complaints before official institutes, ombudsman or whatever. Now what we've noticed is that there's been a lot of going on about these encampments where people have been living for many times, and many of the municipalities are trying to take these encampments away, and they're telling people you can live in stone houses. So that's very contrary to the culture of these people. There was a group of people of a traveler community who brought the complaints to us, and we said, well, this is a discrimination on the part of the government, on the part of the local government, to try and do away with the encampment. So then one problem was solved for one community, one place, and then we were kind of flooded with complaints from other people in other traveler communities. And we were able, not in all cases, but to establish discrimination. So what we found now is that there's been a kind of maybe emancipation and a sense of self-awareness in the field of their housing. And it's not only us, it's also been a national ombudsman, there's also been NGOs who've taken up the issue. But what we see, there's kind of people are more aware of themselves, are proud of the things they stand for, are proud of the culture they stand for, and that's something that's really, you can really pinpoint it to the fact that an organization like ours has been open to the complaints of the traveler community.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, it's very interesting and at the same time a difficult question. I mentioned in my presentation that the fact how you assess whether recommendations are fulfilled or not is very difficult, or sometimes impossible even. When the public defender submits its report, annual report, before the Parliament of Georgia, and assessment take place, what are the recommendations, and those recommendations are given to relevant state agencies, then they have to report back what they did. But you know what happens? There's never agreement whether recommendation is fulfilled or not. The government says that when you said the conditions are bad in prisons, I did it, you painted the wall. But if this is just a fulfillment of the recommendations or not, it's just another question. This is why I mentioned earlier that we are now working to create follow-up mechanism to the recommendations of the Public Defender of Georgia, which means not only just creating the system for these purposes, but at the same time it means that we learn how to write recommendations. It's very necessary prerequisite to measure whether it is implemented or not. I mentioned earlier that if you give general recommendation, you will never assess when it is fulfilled or not. That's why you have to formulate the recommendation in a very good manner to be precise and concise, and how you just can easily assess it is implemented or not. And finally, this will ensure, we believe, to have information what is the impact of recommendations. But normally and in practice, the recommendations of public defender is very authoritative, and hardly government institution can justify non-fulfillment of the recommendations of the public defender of Georgia. As for the complaint mechanism, I would like to divide this question in two parts. First, the general complaint mechanism, where all individuals can file a complaint regarding all issues of human rights within the Public Defender's Office. And next one is complaint procedure vis-à-vis the equality issues. Because I mentioned that the Public Defender's Office in Georgia is an equality body. It is just like a quasi-judicial body which examines the complaints, and which may also conduct the hearing of a case, and issues the recommendations, which is mandatory for public institutions, and unfortunately not mandatory for private institutions, which is the gap and obstacle for the respective law. But in the latter case, the public defender plays a very important role when he's dealing and tackling with equality issues in the country. As for the former, which is general complaint procedure, it is very important system for individuals, and it's also at the same time very popular system for individuals, let's say this way, because every year the number of complaints increases. For example, if I'm not mistaken, there were more than thousands of complaints last year lodged within the Public Defender's Office, which means that the trust of the individuals are very high for the Public Defender's Office, and they want to find truth and to somehow avail this opportunity of the Public Defender's Office in cases.
So the first question from here was about how to describe impact in this era of shrinking public spaces. And from the perspective of my institute, I think there's actually two elements in that question, so that's how I'm going to respond it. We spend a lot of time trying to monitor and track the effects of our work. And we do that through what happens with the legal briefs that we submit. Does it actually change the legislation? We do that through the reports that does it change policy? Do we see kind of new things? So we do a lot on simply tracking what we do. And in 2019, the directors will work more with external stakeholders in having a discussion on it. So it's very much on the agenda of senior management. It's very much on the agenda of our board. So there's kind of some discussions going on there. And I should say civil society also represented on our board, not just in the council. So they're also where real decisions are being taken about the strategic direction and financial issues and so on. And also in our international work, we are introducing a monitoring and evaluation approach called outcome harvesting, because we want to be much better at what type of changes we achieve with our partners there. So it's very high on the agenda, because we know it's an important way of securing legitimacy for what we do and showing that it actually matters. Now, in terms of this issue of how this relates to the issue of shrinking political space, I don't think that's the big problem we're facing in Denmark. I think the problem we're facing is scapegoating of the international human rights bodies and courts and the wider project. It's not that civil society can't speak or access, that we don't have a free discussion. So that's a little bit different from what we see in a number of other countries. It's the scapegoating that we have to tackle, and that happens from a number of politicians and parties that are annoyed with the rulings from the European Court of Human Rights. And so my director has been very involved in public debate written a book about legitimacy of that, and his message say, okay, you want changes to this, you want to step out of a convention, well, what is it, what differences do you want, what is that kind of other human rights project that is there, and try to do some pushback, because scapegoating is very easy as a rhetorical strategy, but actually taking responsibility for what is the alternative. And that type of pushback, in a sense, sometimes works, because they don't have a scenario for an alternative. They just want the political benefits of criticizing something, right? And there's more elements of how we've worked, try to explain and say, no, it's actually not European court rulings, it's problems in domestic Danish jurisprudence, so don't scapegoat Strasbourg, scapegoat your own laws. I mean, in the sense that pushing back against the strategies and the rhetoric that politicians use, and bring in kind of a substantive challenge on that. And to the overall question, it's also about keeping the human rights issues that we raise very broad. So we're working across a whole spectrum, because if we only focused on asylum and refugee law, we would lose most times right now in changing laws. But we work across the whole spectrum of gender, equality, children, elderly, and so on. We keep that broader human rights project open, and then we can sometimes make sure that there are changes in asylum practices and what goes on in refugee camps. So keeping that project open and broad and working across that is, I think, a very important interface for this. Now, in terms of your question about complaint handling, we're the institution that does not do that. And that has, I guess, certain problems and I wouldn't say certain benefits. We do provide counseling, like people who are in problem, need advice, can contact us around our equal treatment areas. And some issues we can help raise. There is a board for equal treatment, so we can take that off of that. But there is another structure that around equal treatment, at least, deals with that, and they have a kind of some legal authority for implementing the decisions. Would it benefit our work? I think that's a real big discussion, because I think we're seeing some institutions around the world that are doing extremely well, who are able to, I mean, Peru, they're handling more than 100,000 individual complaints per year because they've set up the structures. Others are being bogged down by simply just doing this, right? So I don't think we have an explanation on what is going on. I think we should have stronger procedures for handling complaints. And we're seeing, especially around economic and social rights, that the courts in Denmark are not very strong in upholding kind of when there's been mistreatment or rights violations of individuals. And this is also what we hear from lawyers who are trying to push these cases, that sometimes the courts are too loyal to what was the expressed intent of the parliamentarians, instead of upholding what should be kind of international standards. So there we have a mismatch, and a complaint handling structure there would do something there, because it's very hard to count those cases, and we're not seeing the type of jurisprudence coming out of those cases that we think should be there. So that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's time now to close the session. I would thank very much again the speakers for a presentation.